Hello out there in Zoom land. My name is Jeff Jones and I am professor of Russian and Soviet history at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And today I would like to discuss with you a summary of my book from a few years ago. If you can give me a second here, I'd like to bring up the PowerPoint, if it will cooperate. That is basically cooperating, I think. Hopefully, although it's loading, you will be able to see this in a second. First of all, while it's loading, and there it is, I guess, I would like to thank the Hickory Public Library for giving me this opportunity to discuss my work, and specifically Matt Dale and Hannah Norcott for arranging this presentation in this series. The title of my talk for right now is Post-World War II Reconstruction in the Soviet Union, Myths and Realities. It is, as noted, based on my book, Everyday Life in the Reconstruction of Soviet Russia During and After the Great Patriotic War, 1943-1948, long title, published by Slavica back in 2008, excuse me. So they had informed me, that is Matt Dale and Hannah Norcott, that the theme, the overall theme for the series that they're putting together emphasizes myths and fairy tales, and my very academic study surprisingly fits that broad theme quite well, because my focus in my work is on the everyday life, everyday reality of everyday life in the Soviet Union in the post-World War, in the Reconstruction period, 1943 to 1948, beneath the myth of Reconstruction propagated by the Soviet regime, which was this ideal that all Soviet people united together following their heroic victory over Nazi Germany to rebuild their war-torn country amid tremendous sacrifice for the greater good. Of course, I must state at the outset, there is, as is always the case, there's a grain of reality, there's a grain of truth that is embedded within this political myth. Soviet population did manage to rebuild its devastating economy and society following 4 years of an absolutely devastating conflict that included Nazi occupation of much of the country. But the problem, of course, and as always, is that this myth conceals as much as it reveals. The reality was that people endured unbelievable, unimaginable suffering, and that the war enhanced already existing divisions within Soviet society, as well as creating and opening up new divisions in some sense as well. As a matter of fact, I argue that contrary to the myth of unity and the regime's Soviet regime has always claimed to be a classless society. But I assert that, in fact, this period of post-war reconstruction in the country exposes a very clear class divide, in my opinion, in my interpretation of the sources, based on, that is to say, a class divide between, on the one hand, a party elite, and on the other hand, the working class, in whose name the party ostensibly ruled. And workers, most workers, were acutely aware of this divide, and as I'll try to indicate in the sources, often railed about it as well. I approached this topic of post-war Soviet reconstruction as a case study, a local study, if you will, based on mostly on research from my archival sources in Rostov-on-Don, down here in the south. It's a very interesting place. It's about 800 miles south-southwest, as you can see, of Moscow. Rostov was occupied twice by the Nazis during the war. It was absolutely devastated. It was occupied briefly for about a week, by the way, by Nazi troops in November of 1941, but then mostly for about a 6-7 month period from July 1942 to February 1943. It was the site of several major battles, especially that last one in February 1943 that left Rostov, as was true of many Soviet cities in the occupied areas in particular, absolutely devastated at the end of the war. I utilize a variety of sources, some of which I'll describe and talk about here, to look at several thematic slices of everyday life for the people of Rostov between 1943, which again, February 43 was the final liberation from Nazi occupation, and 1948, which is when the Stalinist regime officially declared the end of post-war reconstruction. And I start with the material conditions that people endured during this period of Reconstruction, depicting the extreme poverty and deprivation of the vast majority of the population of people living there. There was a terrible famine in the USSR after the war, 1946-47. I did a lot of interviews. That was one of my main sources. I was doing my research, by the way, in the mid-1990s, so there were a lot of people still around who remembered the 40s, and sort of general theme, but a lot of them would say things like, yeah, the war years were tough, but the really bad years were right after the war during the famine. They had it particularly bad in this period, 46-47. I will say, as a caveat to that, an addendum, that a lot of people told me as well, though, that one benefit from the war was that they had destroyed the fishing industry, the fighting, the Germans, the occupation. So they hadn't done much fishing, at least on a large industrial scale, in the war years. And as a result, the fish population had replenished itself during the war. And several people told me if it hadn't been for the fish, many, many, many more people would have starved. They really relied heavily on fish to feed the population, which saved a lot of people, apparently, in this terrible famine of 46-47. The other key source, living conditions, housing was in extremely short supply, very difficult to come by. It was already, before the war even started, there was a shortage of housing in Rostov because there had been rapid urban migration and with industrialization in the 1930s. And now, of course, during the war and the fighting, there was a lot of the housing was destroyed. One report I saw estimated that 75% of the city's pre-war housing stock had been either destroyed outright or severely damaged and unlivable as a result of the war. People lived in dug out houses, bunkers, I should say, just dug out holes in the mud, literally next to the river, especially. They lived in hallways. They lived in severely damaged buildings that were not safe for habitation. I read about one scientist who worked at the city's morgue, and he also slept and lived there because he had nowhere else to go as well. Sort of a related issue and problem along these lines as well was street crime. Whenever you have terrible economic conditions, you have a terrible crime problem usually, right? And that was certainly true in the Soviet Union in this post-war period as well. Reflected, this deprivation of the population. One of the stories I uncovered was in 1946. This was in Saratov, not Rostov, to be fair, but in 1946, a popular local musician, kind of a local hero of sorts, a celebrity, had died in 1946, and the next day after his funeral, they found his body dug up. And someone had dug up his coffin and stolen the clothes that he was buried in, presumably to sell them on the market to make a little bit of money the next day. There was a organized crime syndicate operating in Rostov and elsewhere called Black Cat. Local party reports, I found this is an interesting tidbit during this period, 46, 47, 48. They noted that in the winter, in particular, workers were very worried about crime, so much so because it got dark so early in the winter, they would get off work in the best of times at 5 o'clock, not counting overtime, and they would bring mats with them to just lay down there on the floor and sleep on the mats at the factory, at the work site, because they were afraid to walk home in the dark, because crime, getting mugged was such a huge problem. This was nationwide, by the way. Viktor Zima is a Russian historian who has looked into this and describes it as a national crime wave in this period, the post-war years, not just Rostov. By far the biggest political challenge facing the Stalinist regime in the post-war period was the issue of collaboration. This is something broadly a broad problem. It's not just Soviet Union, it's much of formerly occupied Europe are dealing with this question. How do you deal with those who in one way or another had worked with or cooperated or collaborated with the Germans? In the case of Rostov, especially during that 6-month period of the occupation of the city. An editorial in the local newspaper, Mullet or Hammer. I relied heavily, of course, on the local press as part of one of my sources. The local newspaper printed an article entitled "Every Family Has Its Freaks," which framed that issue in a very interesting way. It recounts the story of 2 local women who slept with Nazi officers during their occupation of the city, horizontal collaboration, as it was called, and also a local man, who had agreed to spy for the Germans as well. Not surprisingly, the Stalinist regime, cracked down very harshly on the most egregious cases of blatant blatant cases of collaboration. There were some public hangings, not in Rostov, most famously in Krasnodar, south of Rostov, and elsewhere. But the problem with this issue, of course, is it's not always very clear. There's a lot of gray area. What exactly constitutes collaboration? And I found that in the case of Rostov, local authorities were surprisingly lenient toward all but the absolute worst cases of collaboration, in part because they face such a severe shortage of labor. This is one of the major problems as well facing the city. There simply were not enough workers to put the pieces back together again, so to speak, in this period of Reconstruction, especially skilled workers. Skilled labor was in severely short supply. Surprisingly, somewhat, local leaders were relatively lenient, except for the absolute worst cases of collaboration. It's a bit of a dilemma on this tricky topic. Another key political issue in the Soviet Union in the post-war years was a series of elections to the local and national Soviets, the party's organs of governance, relatively powerless, but they made a big deal out of it nonetheless. In 1946 and 1947, there were a series of elections. And mind you that the Soviet regime took these very, very seriously. They claimed to have what they dubbed their system socialist democracy, which they said was more democratic than the West's bourgeois democracy. And they took these elections very, very seriously, expended a great deal of resources in holding these elections. But they were, of course, not very democratic at all. There was only one candidate on the ballot, and you as a voter, as you entered the polling site, it was not unlike here, would be at a school or a union hall maybe, something of that nature, and they would check your name off against a registration list to make sure you're voting in the right precinct and all of that. And then they would give you the ballot with the one name for each position to vote, the approved candidate for each position, one candidate, and you were to take that ballot over to the ballot box and drop it in without any changes if you agreed with the party's candidate. Or you did have the option, they provided a voting booth with a curtain that you could step in behind if you so choose and mark off the candidate's name, thereby indicating that you voted against the one approved candidate for that position of the Communist Party, the Communist Party approved candidate. Of course, that was taking calculated risk because the people at the registration desk were certainly taking notes as to who stepped behind the curtain in the booth, and they knew perfectly well who you were because you just checked in registration, etc. This was not a safe thing to do, and it was fundamentally undemocratic, to put it mildly. A popular joke at the time, told me by one of the people that I interviewed, Maria Jacques, compared Soviet elections to God appearing before Eve and telling her to choose a husband when, of course, Adam was the only choice. Right? The Soviets really, really, really wanted everyone to vote. They took a sort of carrot and stick approach to this. You could be quite seriously reprimanded and penalized, most notably by having your ration cards taken away from you, which was tantamount to almost a death sentence in a way, especially during this period of the famine, for not voting. But the regime also took the carrot approach. For example, they would provide a buffet of food at the polling site. When you voted, you got to eat. And that was a pretty strong way to draw in, a pretty effective way to draw in voters, especially during a famine. That said, people voted. They went through the motions, mostly without a whole lot of enthusiasm from what I could sense. A lot of people recognized the process as a farce, to put it mildly. One district party leader described how at a campaign meeting in his district, a group of workers afterwards got together, and he overheard one of them saying, "What sort of democracy is this when we have to vote for a person we don't know, whom they force upon us, and we're not allowed to write in our own candidate?" So clearly not everyone, and especially not all workers in this alleged worker state, bought into the regime's myth of Reconstruction, emphasizing the unity of the population at this difficult time. One of the reasons there was a lack of unity also was rampant corruption, another huge problem, a key characteristic of this period, rampant corruption. The regime readily admitted that this was a problem in the local press. It was far too obvious to hide. One article in 1947 in the local newspaper Mullet, which means hammer, was entitled, quote, "How does one steal an apartment in broad daylight?" And the article went on to explain how a resident had paid a local housing official a bribe to confirm his fictitious claim to an apartment he had allegedly owned before the war, although he had no documentation to prove it. And they had to evict the current tenants of that apartment to then give it to this person on the basis of this rather unsavory deal. So this was blatant corruption, and in the realm of housing, as noted before, very significant for that reason alone. The problem of corruption certainly did not escape the attention of workers. One worker was overheard by an informant. By the way, this is one of the sources I relied on heavily for, especially kind of what the people on the street were saying, were informant reports that would overhear, called svotki in Russian. They would overhear what people were saying, co-workers, friends, family, professors, or just fellow students in class, as the case may be, and then they would report to the NKVD. The NKVD at the time was what later became the KGB, and they would report what so-and-so had said. In one of these instances, one of the quotes I really liked was one worker overheard by an informant saying, quote, "Right now you can't get anything done without a bribe. Everyone knows it, but you can't do anything about it." I show here the recent book, a very interesting book by James Heinzen about the corruption of the Stalin period. It's precisely what we're talking about here. The Art of the Bribe, very, very telling account indeed, 1943, 1953. In short, bribes, corruption, payoffs, all sorts of corruption, very, very, very pervasive, an essential part of post-war Soviet life. One interesting little tidbit on this, by the way, as far as the sources and how you deal with the sources and some of the problems you can encounter. In many of my interviews, when I asked people about corruption, they would say, the vast majority of the interviewees would say, "Oh, there was no corruption in the Stalin period. Everyone was much too afraid." Now, later it became an issue, but not during the Stalin period. Everyone was much too afraid to take a bribe. And clearly that was not the case, because the documents and James Heinzen study certainly confirms this, and my look at corruption in Rostov, rampant, profoundly plentiful corruption and bribes being paid at every level almost during this period. So a discrepancy, and of course in that case, interviewees' memories might not be quite the best. It's been a long time after all, 4 or 5 decades. So you obviously will go with the documented evidence over the interviews in those cases. A related issue, by the way, is the problem of speculation, as the Soviets called it. It's basically the buying and selling of goods for profit. It was the illegal market economy. And this was hugely prominent, is really thriving. The illegal market was a thriving aspect of the Soviet economy during this period. During the war, really, right up until 1948, they tried to clamp down on it in 1948. Julie Hessler, a very skilled historian, has a great article called Post-War Perestroika covering this window here, which basically the government did not even try to repress the market economy because so many people were reliant upon it and depended on it so heavily to survive during the war years that clamping down on the illegal economy would have led to a lot of suffering, even more suffering and pain and starvation. So the government tended to look the other way until 1948, when they do try to clamp down in conjunction with the monetary reform that they carry out in that year, 1948. But the illegal market economy survived, certainly. It was just a bit more muted, a bit more underground than it had been during this period of 43 to 48. And it was also, by the way, the illegal economy very closely linked to the issue of corruption, because many of the local party leaders who had access to scarce goods would divert some of these goods, or a lot of these goods, onto the illegal market economy, where they knew, in conjunction with some shady figures, speculators as they were known, they could make a lot of money, and no doubt many of them did so. Finally, and lastly on this regard, another feature that stands out in this period without a doubt is worker opposition to the state. Not something we would tend to associate with an allegedly totalitarian Stalinist system, but the sources are pretty clear. There was a lot of small scale, mind you, worker opposition. There were mini strikes, that is MINI strikes in factories. There were walkouts. There were work slowdowns. Mostly, as Donald Filzer, among other, in his book on labor in the post-World War II period has shown, these were individualized, localized protests, not organized, not unified at all, but they were quite common based on the sources and rather widespread. A related issue, and one again that was very, very prominent and something that I had from a lot of different sources, was workplace theft or pilfering. Very common. And the stolen goods were often then sold or traded on the illegal market. Again, as just a key form of survival for an awful lot of people in these very, very trying times. One former factory worker that I interviewed told me that he worked in a paper factory, and he said that he and the other workers stole, quote, everything that was not locked down from the factory that they worked in. I mean, they saw the collaboration, they saw the, speculation going on among the party leaders, and they felt that it was their right, in a sense, to get what they could as well. So workers, in short, found ways to survive in these very, very hard times. They developed a variety of survival strategies in the face of tremendous hardship. So in conclusion, the reality of everyday life in post-war Soviet Russia did not much resemble the Stalinist regime's myth of Reconstruction. In fact, and in particular, at least based on my interpretation of the sources, there was a clear divide between the ruling party elite on the one hand and the working class for whom they allegedly ruled on the other hand. And the workers realized this discrepancy and voiced their opposition in various ways to the party elite's privileged, relatively privileged position, without a doubt. I am happy to have shared, hopefully not too painful. If you have any questions at all about my presentation, feel free to email me at jwjones@uncg.edu. Again, that is jwjones@uncg.edu. Thank you for listening, and assuming I can figure out how to get out here, I will bid you all farewell. Thank you.